Picture this. It's a Tuesday afternoon, completely normal day. You're at work, maybe you're in a meeting, maybe you're answering emails, and then your phone buzzes. You look down and it's your mechanic. You pick up and he tells you your transmission just went out. And the repair? $1,400. Maybe it's $2,200. And right there, in that moment, your stomach drops. Not because you don't have the money in your bank account necessarily, but because you do have it in your bank account and you know that if you spend it, you're completely wiped out. Rent is in 3 weeks, your insurance is due, and you've got nothing behind that money. Nothing. No cushion, no backup. Just a big fat zero staring back at you if this one expense goes through. That feeling right there, that nauseating, chest-tightening panic, that is what a missing emergency fund feels like. And if that scenario hit a little too close to home, you are exactly who this video is for. My name is John, and I spend way too much time thinking about personal finance and why the traditional advice people get almost never actually works for real people in the real world. If you're someone who knows they should have savings but can never seem to actually build them, or you've tried to save money before and something always comes up and wipes it out, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this ends up helping you out. Because today, we are going to talk about emergency funds. Not in the boring, generic, just save 3 to 6 months of expenses way in that every financial article on the internet tells you, but in a way that actually makes sense for someone starting from literally zero. The psychology, the math, the strategy, the order of operations, all of it. Let's get into it. Here's the thing. When most people hear the term emergency fund, they immediately think one of two things. Either they think, yeah, I know I need one of those, I'll get to it eventually. Or they think, that sounds great, but I'm barely making it as it is. I don't have extra money to just set aside somewhere. And both of those responses, while completely understandable, are actually based on a misunderstanding of what an emergency fund really is and why it matters so much. So let's start at the very beginning. What actually is an emergency fund? Because I think a lot of people have a fuzzy idea of it, but not a precise one, and precision matters a lot here. An emergency fund is a dedicated pool of cash that you set aside specifically for unplanned, necessary expenses. Notice I said two things there, unplanned and necessary. Both of those words matter. Unplanned means you didn't see it coming. A car repair, a medical bill, an unexpected job loss, your water heater dying in December. These are things that don't show up on your budget because you didn't know they were going to happen. And necessary means it's not optional. This isn't a concert ticket you forgot about. It's not a birthday dinner you want to go to. It's something that genuinely needs to be dealt with financially, and it needs to be dealt with right now. The reason I'm being precise about this is because the definition of an emergency fund has gotten so distorted in popular culture that a lot of people either dip into it for non-emergencies and then wonder why it's always depleted, or they feel so much guilt about their emergency fund being empty that they just kind of stop thinking about it entirely, and neither of those outcomes is helpful. Now, here's the first thing I want to challenge, and this might push back against something you've heard 100 times before. The conventional wisdom on emergency funds says you need 3 to 6 months of living expenses saved up. You've heard that, right? 3 to 6 months. And look, on paper, that advice isn't wrong. If you have 3 to 6 months of expenses saved up, you are genuinely in a much better financial position than the average American. The problem is that advice is essentially useless to someone who's starting from zero. Because if you're sitting there with nothing in savings, telling you that you need to save up, let's say, $15,000 or $20,000 or even $8,000 before you're financially safe is like telling someone who's drowning that they need to learn how to swim. Technically true, completely unhelpful in the moment. Here's what most people don't realize. There are actually two completely different phases of building an emergency fund, and most financial advice collapses them into one, which is why people get so overwhelmed and never actually start. Phase 1 is what I call the financial circuit breaker. Phase 2 is the full safety net, and these two phases have completely different goals, completely different timelines, and they require completely different mindsets. Most people skip phase 1, jump straight to thinking about phase 2, get overwhelmed, and do nothing. That pattern is the silent killer of financial progress for tens of millions of people. So let's talk about Phase 1, the financial circuit breaker. The goal of Phase 1 is simple. We are not trying to make you financially secure. We're not trying to protect you from a job loss or a major medical event. We are just trying to stop the bleeding. We are trying to break the cycle that keeps so many people trapped, where every single small financial setback sends them directly to a credit card or a personal loan or asking a family member for money, which then creates debt, which then creates interest payments, which then reduces the amount of money they have each month, which then makes it even harder to save anything, which then means the next small financial setback sends them back to the credit card. That cycle, we're trying to break it. And here's the thing about that cycle. It's way more common than people want to admit. According to a Federal Reserve survey, roughly 37% of Americans would struggle to cover an unexpected $400 expense without borrowing money or selling something. Think about that. Nearly 4 in 10 people in the wealthiest country on the earth cannot comfortably handle $400 of unexpected costs. That's a transmission repair. That's an emergency room copay. That's a last-minute flight for a family situation. $400. So Phase 1 of your emergency fund is not 3 to 6 months of expenses. Phase 1 is $1,000. That's it. $1,000 sitting in a separate savings account, not touched, not invested, not mixed in with your checking account, not mentally earmarked for anything else. Just $1,000 that exists for the sole purpose of absorbing small financial emergencies so that you don't have to go into debt when they happen. Now, you might be thinking, John, $1,000, that's nothing. That doesn't feel like a real emergency fund. And you're right, it's not a complete emergency fund, but here's what $1,000 actually does. It covers the average car repair. According to AAA, the average unexpected vehicle repair in the United States costs between $500 and $600. $1,000 covers that and then some. It covers most urgent care or emergency room visits after insurance. It covers a broken phone that you rely on for work. It covers a last-minute flight for a family situation. It covers most of the small, unpredictable financial shocks that the average person experiences in a given year. And crucially, it covers them without putting you in debt. And this is where it gets really interesting, because the psychological effect of that $1,000 buffer is wildly out of proportion to the actual dollar amount. When you have $1,000 sitting there as a dedicated emergency fund, your relationship with money changes, like fundamentally changes, in a way that's hard to explain until you've experienced it. You stop operating from a place of scarcity and panic. You start making decisions from a slightly more rational place because you know that if something goes wrong, you have a little bit of runway. You're not one flat tire away from a financial crisis. And that psychological shift, that reduction in financial anxiety, actually makes you a better decision maker across the board. You're less likely to make impulsive purchases. You're less likely to avoid opening your bank statements. You're less likely to give up on your budget entirely when something unexpected happens. There is research in behavioral economics, and shout out to the work of Sindhu Mullainathan and Eldar Shafir on this, that demonstrates that financial scarcity actually consumes cognitive bandwidth, meaning that when you're constantly stressed about money, your brain has less capacity for good decision-making in other areas of your life. That's not a moral failing. That's not laziness or weakness. That is a documented psychological phenomenon. And $1,000 in an emergency fund starts to relieve some of that cognitive pressure. It's not a perfect fix, but it's a real one. Okay, so we know the goal for Phase 1 is $1,000. Now let's talk about the math of actually getting there, because this is where I see a lot of people lose the plot. Let's say you make $3,000 a month take-home. That's after taxes. Pretty realistic for a lot of working adults. And let's say after your rent, your utilities, your groceries, your transportation, your subscriptions, all of it, you've got, I don't know, maybe $200 left over at the end of the month. Maybe it's $150. Maybe on a good month it's $300. But let's work with $200 as our baseline. At $200 a month going to your emergency fund, you hit $1,000 in 5 months. 5 months, that's it. That's not 5 years. It's not even a year. It's 5 months from right now, you could have a full Phase 1 emergency fund built, and you would never have to pay interest on a car repair or a medical bill again. When you think about it that way, it actually doesn't sound that hard, right? But here's where people get tripped up. They don't automate it. They say, okay, I'll save what's left at the end of the month. And what happens at the end of the month?
There's nothing left because money has this magical property where it expands to fill whatever container you give it. If you have $200 extra in your checking account, life will find a way to spend that $200. Dinner out, an impulse buy, a streaming service you forgot about, it doesn't matter. The money will disappear. This is not a character failing. This is just how human psychology works with money. We tend to spend what's available to us. The solution is to pay yourself first. And I know, you've heard that phrase before. It sounds like a bumper sticker, but the mechanics of it actually matter. What this means in practice is that the moment your paycheck hits your checking account, before you pay any bills, before you buy groceries, before you do anything, an automatic transfer moves your savings contribution into your emergency account. For most people, that's somewhere between $50 and $200 per paycheck, depending on your income and expenses. The key word is automatic.
Option 1 is expense reduction. Now, I'm not going to tell you to stop buying coffee because that's condescending advice that ignores the actual math of most people's financial situations. But I will tell you to audit your subscriptions and recurring charges. The average American spends over $200 a month on subscriptions, according to a 2022 study by C+R Research. That includes streaming services, gym memberships, app subscriptions, meal kit services, all of it. $200 a month. If you go through your bank statements right now, actually right now, like pause this video and do it, I would bet you find at least $30 to $50 a month in subscriptions you had completely forgotten about or that you're not actually using. Option 2 is income supplementation. And look, I know get a side hustle is advice that can feel dismissive when you're already exhausted from your main job. So I'm not going to tell you to start a drop shipping business or whatever. But I will say this, a one-time burst of extra income can change your savings timeline dramatically. Selling stuff you don't use anymore on Facebook Marketplace or eBay, doing a weekend of gig work through DoorDash or Instacart for a month or two, picking up one extra shift if you work in a field where that's possible. If you could generate an extra $300 or $400 in the next 60 days, you've compressed your timeline to your first $1,000 from 10 months down to maybe 6 months or less. That matters. Momentum matters. Getting there faster matters because it reduces the amount of time you're exposed to financial fragility. All right, so let's say you've built your $1,000 Phase 1 emergency fund. You've got it sitting in a separate account, and we will talk about where to keep it in just a minute, and you feel that little bit of financial breathing room for the first time. What comes next? Here's what most people don't realize about this moment. This is actually a fork in the road that a lot of financial advice doesn't acknowledge properly. Because the conventional wisdom would say now you just keep doing what you're doing and build from $1,000 up to your full 3 to 6 months. Just keep saving, keep piling it up, simple. But that's not necessarily the right next step for everyone, and blindly following that advice can actually cost you thousands of dollars. Here's the thing, if you have high-interest debt, and by high interest, I mean anything above 8 or 9%, but especially credit card debt that's sitting at 20, 22, 24% interest, then mathematically, the next priority after your $1,000 emergency fund is actually paying off that high-interest debt, not continuing to build your savings. Let me show you why with real numbers, because this is important. Let's say you have $5,000 in credit card debt at a 22% interest rate. Every single month that you carry that balance, you are paying roughly $92 in interest. That's over $1,000 a year just in interest, just to keep that balance sitting there. Now compare that to what your savings account is earning you. The best high-yield savings accounts right now are paying somewhere around 4 to 5% annual percentage yield, which is actually pretty good historically. But on a $1,000 emergency fund, that's $40 to $50 per year in interest income. You're losing over $1,000 a year to that credit card debt and making maybe $40 or $50 on your savings. The math is not even close. So for most people with high-interest debt, the priority order looks like this. Get to $1,000 in your emergency fund first, and do not skip this step, because if you skip this and throw everything at debt, the next emergency puts you right back on the credit card, and you've made zero net progress. Once you hit that $1,000 cushion, shift your extra money toward aggressively paying down high-interest debt. Once the high-interest debt is gone, then you go back and complete phase 2 of your emergency fund. This is what personal finance people call the debt avalanche or debt snowball method, intersecting with the emergency fund strategy. And getting the order of operations right can save you thousands of dollars compared to just following generic advice blindly. Now, a lot of people hearing this will ask, what if I have student loans? What about a car payment? What about my mortgage? Look, those are important questions, but they belong in a longer conversation about debt strategy. For the purposes of this video, what I want you to focus on is this. If you have debt with an interest rate below, let's call it 7 or 8%, that's generally considered low-interest debt in the context of personal finance, and you can build your emergency fund and work on that debt simultaneously without the same urgency. But anything above that rate, especially credit card debt, needs to be treated like a financial emergency in and of itself. All right, let's now talk about phase 2. The full safety net, because this is the part that actually protects you from major life disruptions, a job loss, a serious medical event, a family crisis that requires you to take time off work. The classic advice is 3 to 6 months of expenses, and that's still a reasonable target. But let me make it more concrete, because 3 to 6 months of expenses is a pretty abstract concept until you actually sit down and do the math. First, what counts as an expense for this calculation? We're talking about your essential monthly costs: rent or mortgage, utilities, groceries, transportation, insurance premiums, minimum debt payments. That's it. We are not including your Netflix subscription. We are not including dining out or entertainment. We are calculating the bare minimum it costs you to keep a roof over your head, food in your body, and your financial obligations current while you get back on your feet after a setback. For the average single adult renting an apartment in a mid-sized American city, that number might look something like this. Rent, $1,200, utilities, $150, groceries, $300, car payment and insurance, $450, phone, $80, minimum debt payments, let's say $200, health insurance, if applicable, maybe $150. That adds up to around $2,500 to $2,800 per month in genuine bare minimum essential expenses. 3 months of that is roughly $8,000. 6 months is roughly $16,000. Now here's where I want to challenge you on something, because the 3 to 6 month rule, while useful as a guideline, is actually a spectrum, and where you fall on that spectrum should depend on your specific life situation. If you have stable employment, meaning you work for a solid company or organization, your job isn't in a volatile industry, and realistically, if you lost your job, you could probably find comparable work within 2 or 3 months, then 3 months of expenses is a reasonable target for your full emergency fund. If you're self-employed, a freelancer, a contractor, or if you work in an industry that has significant volatility, think real estate, construction, tech startups, commission-based sales, then you need to be closer to 6 months, maybe even a little more, because the income disruption risk is higher, and frankly, the time it takes to rebuild your income if something goes wrong is often longer. If you have dependents, children, a spouse who doesn't work or works part-time, aging parents you're helping support, that also nudges you toward the higher end, because in a financial emergency, you can cut your own spending to almost nothing if you absolutely have to, but you can't really do that when other people are depending on you. And if you have a medical condition or a health situation that makes you more likely to face significant medical expenses, that's another reason to keep your emergency fund closer to the 6-month end, and potentially even beyond it. Okay, let me now address something that comes up literally every time I talk about emergency funds, and it is a completely legitimate question. Where should I keep this money? Here's what most people don't realize about this. A huge number of people keep their emergency fund money mixed in with their regular checking account, and I completely understand why. It's convenient, it's easy, it's already there, but it is almost guaranteed to cause problems. Because when your emergency fund money is sitting in the same account as your spending money, your brain doesn't treat it differently. It just looks like money, available money, and available money gets spent. Not because you're irresponsible, but because that's just how humans relate to accessible funds when they're in the same mental and physical bucket as spending money.
The solution is a separate account, preferably at a completely different bank or financial institution from your primary checking account. Not because you're trying to make it impossible to access, you absolutely need to be able to access it in an emergency, but because you want friction. You want the process of transferring money from that account to your spending account to take at least a little bit of thought and time. That friction prevents the casual, unconscious dipping into your emergency fund for things that are not actually emergencies. And here's the other piece of this. Where specifically should that separate account be? The answer, in the current rate environment, is a high-yield savings account, or HYSA for short. Traditional savings accounts at big banks like Chase or Bank of America or Wells Fargo pay approximately nothing in interest. We're talking 0.01% to maybe 0.1% annually. On a $5,000 emergency fund, that's $5 to 50 cents a year in interest. It's basically nothing. High-yield savings accounts, which you can open at online banks like Marcus by Goldman Sachs, Ally Bank, Discover Bank, SoFi, and others. Many of these have no minimum balance and no monthly fees. These accounts pay somewhere in the range of 4 to 5% annually right now. On that same $5,000 emergency fund, you're looking at $200 to $250 per year in interest. That's not going to make you rich, but over time, as your fund grows, that's real money. And more importantly, you are earning something meaningful on money that is otherwise just sitting there waiting to be needed. Now, you might be thinking, what about investing my emergency fund? Couldn't I put it in an index fund or something and earn even more? And this is where I need to push back a little bit, because this is a very common mistake that sounds smart on the surface, but can completely undermine the entire purpose of an emergency fund. The whole point of an emergency fund is that it needs to be stable and accessible. Those are the two non-negotiable requirements. Stable means the value can't drop. If you put your emergency fund in the stock market and the market drops 30%, which it does sometimes more, and then you have a financial emergency at exactly that moment, you've just gotten hit twice. You've lost income or had a major expense, and simultaneously, your emergency fund is worth 30% less than it was. That's the worst possible scenario. An emergency fund in a high-yield savings account won't lose value. The number might not go up much beyond the interest, but it won't go down either. For emergency fund purposes, that stability is worth more than the potential for higher returns. Accessible means you can get to the money within a day or two at most. High-yield savings accounts typically allow transfers within 1 to 2 business days. Some even offer instant transfer options. That's perfectly fine for most financial emergencies. But if you've got your money in a brokerage account, you've got to sell shares, wait for the trade to settle, then transfer the money, which can take 3 to 5 business days or more. For a car repair or a medical bill, that timeline can be genuinely problematic. So, high-yield savings account, separate institution from your primary bank. That's where your emergency fund lives. Now, let me talk about something that I think is one of the most underappreciated aspects of building an emergency fund, which is what happens to your money psychology as you go through this process. Because the math, honestly, is the simpler part. The harder part is maintaining the discipline to build and protect this fund over time, and understanding the psychological dynamics at play can make a massive difference. Here's one of the trickiest things that happens when people start building an emergency fund. They save up, say, $600, and then something goes wrong, a car repair, whatever it is, and they have to use $400 of it. And then they feel like they're back at square one. And that feeling of failure, of taking a step backward, causes a lot of people to just give up. They think, what's the point? I keep trying to save, and something always comes up and takes the money. But here's what's actually happening in that scenario, and this is a complete reframe that I want you to sit with for a second.
If you have $600 in your emergency fund and a $400 emergency hits and you cover it from your emergency fund, you have not failed. You have succeeded at the exact thing an emergency fund is designed to do. You absorbed a financial shock without going into debt, without paying 22% interest on that $400, without having your credit score dinged, without the stress and shame of having to put it on a credit card that you're not sure how you'll pay off. Yes, your emergency fund is now $200. Yes, you need to rebuild it. But the alternative, where you didn't have that $600, would have put you $400 into debt. And when you're starting from zero, $400 of credit card debt is genuinely hard to get out of because of how interest compounds over time. The right way to think about using your emergency fund for its actual purpose is not as a failure or a setback, it's a win. Your emergency fund just did exactly what it was built to do. Now you just have to refill it, and that's okay. That's part of the deal. This is a living financial tool, not a trophy that's supposed to sit there untouched forever. This is where it gets really interesting in terms of the long-term psychological transformation. People who successfully build and maintain an emergency fund over a period of a year or two tend to report a fundamental shift in how they relate to financial emergencies. Instead of the panic and dread and shame that used to come with an unexpected expense, there's almost a sense of calm, a sense of, okay, this is happening. Let me figure out the cost. I know I can cover it. That shift from financial panic mode to financial problem-solving mode is actually one of the most valuable things a well-maintained emergency fund gives you. And it's hard to put a dollar figure on how much better your decision-making becomes when you're operating from a place of constant financial anxiety. Now let's talk about something that doesn't get discussed enough, which is what I call emergency fund creep. This is when the boundaries of what counts as an emergency start to get fuzzy over time, and your emergency fund slowly gets depleted by expenses that are not really emergencies. Here's the test I want you to use every single time you consider tapping your emergency fund. Ask yourself 3 questions. First, was this expense completely unforeseeable? Second, is this expense genuinely necessary, meaning there are real negative consequences if I don't address it? And third, is this expense urgent, meaning it cannot wait until my next paycheck or be solved through normal budgeting? If the answer to all 3 of those questions is yes, completely unforeseeable, genuinely necessary, genuinely urgent, then that is a legitimate emergency fund use. If the answer to any of those questions is no, you need to find another way to cover that expense through your regular budget, a sinking fund, or by adjusting your spending elsewhere. Let me give you some concrete examples to illustrate the line. Your car breaks down and the repair costs $800 and you need your car to get to work. Emergency fund use? Yes. You've known for 6 months that your car registration is coming due and it's $240. Emergency fund use? No. That's a foreseeable expense. It should have been in your budget or a sinking fund. Your appendix bursts and you have surgery with a $1,500 hospital copay. Emergency fund use? Yes. You really want to go on a trip, but you didn't save enough and you're going to miss out if you don't pull from your emergency fund. Emergency fund use? Absolutely not. The more clearly you define what counts as an emergency for you in advance, before the emotional pull of wanting to access that money kicks in, the better you'll be at protecting the fund and keeping it available for when you genuinely need it. Let me also address a question I get a lot, which is what about having multiple accounts for different purposes? Should I have a sinking fund separate from my emergency fund? And the answer is yes, but not until after you've built your emergency fund. A sinking fund is a savings account where you set aside a small amount every month for large, predictable future expenses, things like annual car registration, holiday gifts, a planned vacation, replacing appliances, back-to-school shopping. These are expenses that you know are coming even if you don't know the exact timing down to the day. By putting $20 or $30 or $50 a month into a sinking fund for these categories, you prevent them from becoming surprise expenses that hit your budget like a truck. But again, get the emergency fund built first. Once that's in place, adding sinking funds for predictable large expenses is an excellent strategy. Now I want to spend a few minutes on something that I think is genuinely important and that most personal finance content glosses over completely, which is the intersection of emergency funds and relationships. Because financial discussions, financial decisions, financial stress, these do not happen in a vacuum. They happen in the context of relationships, with partners, with family members, with friends, and the dynamics there can be complicated. If you are in a relationship with a partner and your financial situations are significantly different, maybe you're building your emergency fund from zero while they already have a solid savings cushion, or vice versa, that asymmetry can create tension if it's not talked about openly. The person who feels financially behind can feel shame or resentment. The person who is more financially stable can feel frustrated or overburdened. Neither of those feelings is wrong or irrational, but they can absolutely derail financial progress if they're not addressed. What I'd encourage is a direct, non-judgmental conversation about where each of you actually stands financially, what your goals are, and how you want to handle financial emergencies as a couple or a household. There is no one-size-fits-all answer here. Some couples combine all their finances completely. Some keep everything totally separate. Most fall somewhere in the middle. But whatever the structure, having clarity about who is responsible for what and what happens when an emergency hits is so much better than the alternative of just hoping it works itself out. And if you're sharing finances with a family member or a roommate situation, maybe you're helping a parent financially, or your financial lives are intertwined with a sibling, having these conversations is equally important. Financial boundary setting is hard. It can feel awkward and cold, but the alternative is financial resentment and situations where your own emergency fund gets drained because someone else's emergency becomes your emergency by default. Okay, let's bring all of this together into a concrete action plan, because I don't want you to walk away from this video feeling informed but not knowing what to actually do next. Step 1. Figure out your actual number for a Phase 1 emergency fund. For most people, this is $1,000. If you have genuinely minimal expenses and a very stable job situation, you might argue it could be slightly lower, but honestly, just aim for $1,000. It's a clean, psychologically significant milestone, and it provides real protection. Step 2. Open a dedicated savings account at a separate bank or financial institution from your primary checking account. I'd recommend one of the high-yield online banks I mentioned earlier: Ally, Marcus, SoFi, Discover. These are all FDIC insured, which means your money is federally protected up to $250,000, and they pay significantly more interest than your neighborhood bank. Step 3. Decide how much you can realistically transfer to that account per paycheck. Be honest with yourself. If $50 per paycheck is genuinely what you can do right now, that's what you start with. If you can do $100 or $150, do that. The key is that the amount is automatic and consistent. Set up an auto transfer the day after your paycheck hits. Step 4. Audit your last 2 months of bank and credit card statements and identify at least one expense you can reduce or eliminate to free up additional money for your emergency fund. Even $30 a month adds up to $360 a year. That's more than a third of the way to your first $1,000. Step 5. If you have any high-interest debt, anything above 8 or 9%, make a note of it. Once you hit your $1,000 Phase 1 emergency fund, your next financial priority is aggressively paying down that debt before building toward the full 3 to 6 month emergency fund. I know this feels counterintuitive. Do it anyway. The math supports it. Step 6. Once your high-interest debt is cleared, come back to your emergency fund and build it out to your full target using the same formula. Calculate your monthly essential expenses, multiply by 3 if you have stable income and no dependents, closer to 5 or 6 if you're self-employed, have dependents, or have a volatile income source. Step 7. Define your emergency fund rules before you need them. Write down, literally, on paper or in your phone, what counts as an emergency for you and what doesn't, so that when the moment comes and you're tempted to dip in, you have your own past, clear-headed self holding you accountable. And step 8, this is the one people always skip, celebrate the milestones. When you hit $250 in your emergency fund, acknowledge that. When you hit $500, tell someone you trust. When you hit $1,000, seriously, find a way to mark that moment, not by spending money, obviously, but by recognizing that you did something genuinely difficult. You chose your future self over your present self repeatedly, week after week, and you built something real. That deserves to be acknowledged. Look, here's the thing I really want you to take away from all of this. An emergency fund is not a sexy financial concept. It's not going to make you rich. It's not going to generate passive income. It's not the kind of thing that gets clickbaity YouTube thumbnails and millions of views. But it is, without question, the single most foundational element of financial stability. Every other positive financial goal you have, investing, buying a home, building wealth, achieving financial independence, all of it becomes exponentially harder without this foundation in place. Every unexpected expense that hits without an emergency fund takes you further from those goals. Every one that hits with an emergency fund barely slows you down. People always ask me, John, where do I start with personal finance? And this is always my answer. Not investing, not budgeting apps, not optimizing your credit score. Start here. Build the cushion. Break the cycle. Because once you have this foundation under you, everything else gets so much easier. Not easy, but easier. And that matters. If you're starting from zero today, that's okay. Everyone started from zero at some point. The only question that matters is what you do from here. And you now have a clear roadmap. Use it. Give this video a thumbs up if it helped you see emergency funds differently than you did at the start. And if you know someone who's stuck in that cycle, the paycheck-to-paycheck cycle, the one emergency away from disaster cycle, send them this video. It might actually change something for them. I'll see you in the next one.